All right, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Hope you're having a great day, and I appreciate you clicking on this video. So what you probably already saw from the title of this video is I'm going to be talking today about a study that looks at the effects of a catch and release season versus a closed season in New York State, primarily during the spawning season. The reason I know about this study is because I have a degree in aquatic and fisheries science, and I was working for the USGS doing sturgeon research. Every year in New York State, they have a big fisheries conference that everyone goes to. And I saw the presentation. This was in 2019. I saw this presentation in person. What I'm going to do is play clips of the video from the presentation. We're going to talk about it as it goes, and then I'm really going to try to put my opinion piece in the end, and then hopefully you guys can also comment your opinion and we can have a nice civil discussion about all this. Let's get into it.
So as many of you know, in 2007, New York opened up spring fishing, catch and immediate release for bass. Prior to that, we were one of a handful of states that did not allow spring fishing for bass. Ideally, before you make a major reg change like that, you do some science and then you decide whether or not the reg change is worthwhile. Closed spring seasons are based primarily or almost entirely on two premises. One, that males who are guarding the nest are highly vulnerable to angling. And once you remove a male from a nest, the survival of eggs and fry goes down, thereby reducing your class production.
So this part of the video, he's talking about catching fish off beds. There's a couple different studies that look at whether it's possible or not. I think most people watching this can definitely conclude that you definitely can catch fish off beds. Whether or not they're easy or not, that all depends on the situation of the lake and whether it's a smallmouth or a largemouth. So that poses the question of, is the survival of the eggs and fry reduced when the males are removed?
If you do remove a guardian male from a nest, there's no question that it reduces survival of eggs and fry, because there are predators out there, including our native species like bluegill, pumpkin seed, yellow perch, who are more than happy to go in there and feast on eggs and fry in the absence of a guardian male. The severity of the loss of that nest is based largely on how long the fish is off the nest. If you remove a fish and keep it off, you lose almost all your nest. If you release it pretty quickly, they'll get back on the nest and guard it. If you play with them and wear them out, then you lose a fair number. So that relationship's there, but the nature of the fishery has a lot to do with how serious it is. But the big question as fish managers is not what are we doing to an individual nest, but what are we doing to the bass population. Our primary interest is sustainability of the fishery, not simply for one nest. So the question is not will we hurt this nest, but will we hurt enough nest to actually impact recruitment, near class development, and ultimately the sustainability of the fishery.
And I really like how Jackson actually thinks about this throughout the study, because here he mentions that it really doesn't matter about an individual fish or individual nest. What really matters in the grand scheme of things and in the management questions is how does this affect the production of the young at a lake-wide level, and essentially how does this affect the overall population of the bass in that lake.
There are two schools of thought on this. One is that recruitment is simply a numbers game. The other is more of a lottery. The numbers game, a bunch of bass, they make a bunch of nests, they all make eggs, they make fry. Every nest has a good potential to contribute to the year class. So the impact of spring fishing has to do with the magnitude of the fishery impact. How many nests you ultimately hurt by removing fish from it. And as a percentage of the population that you harvest off nests, the odds that you're going to hurt the year class go up. The other one, which seems to be the prevailing school of thought now, is it's not a numbers game, it's more of a lottery. Not all nests are created equal. Some nests are particularly well positioned to produce a good year class because they have very effective males, or the males attract good females, but not all nests contribute. There's just a subset that does. This thinking based primarily on a study from Minnesota and a small lake in Canada, I believe it was. It showed that most of the year class came from a very small subset of the nest. And this, to my knowledge, this study hasn't been reproduced, but this is pretty much a school of thought that some nests are better than others. So therefore, when you're fishing, the question is not how many nests do you impact, but whether or not you accidentally impact the wrong ones. So if that's true, then we have to revisit what is it that's important for determining your class of bass. We have these life stages that are fairly distinct.
So now for this next section of the study, he's talking about it kind of depends on how you look at the early life history of black bass to decide, does fishing, for bass during the spawn actually affect the population. So you can look at the parent stock, which is like the fish that exist, the actual males and females that are doing the spawning. You can look at their eggs. So their eggs in the nest, the guarded young. So once they hatch and the males are guarding that fry, the first summer, so you're looking at the fry at this point, the conditions that they have during the first summer after they've been born, and then that leads into the first winter, the conditions they have at the first winter after they're born. So to determine if angling during the spawn actually does impact the population, you kind of have to decide which part of this life cycle is the most important for these young of year to survive, or is it multiple parts of this life cycle?
But as scientists are prone to do, we can get a vote for almost any school of thought. There are people who think that stock recruitment is important. They're a minority. A lot of folks think that it's that early production, the number of eggs and juveniles that they get past that guarding stage, and a fair number of folks who think that doesn't matter. What matters is that first year growth and winter survival.
And he talks about here, based on previous studies, there's no general consensus on this. A lot of people think it is the eggs and the young in the nest, and a lot of other people also think it's the conditions of the first summer and the first winter. One thing I noticed in this section is a lot of these studies are quite old. This subject is just not something that the scientific world really studies a lot. The hardcore PhD scientists generally do not seem to focus too much on bass or bass fishing specifically, because it's just not something that they're most interested in.
So because of the reg change, we had a chance to play this game in New York. In 2007, the season that had been historically closed from ice out to the third Saturday of June was opened up to catch and immediate release fishing. And then we could actually do some science stuff. We opened the fishery, and now we can evaluate that because we're, 12 years down the line, and we can look at what happened.
So he talks about they chose 3 lakes that had a long-term data set that would allow them to look at numbers before and after this open and closed season. So the lakes they chose for this specific study were the New York waters of Lake Erie, Oneida Lake, and Canandaigua Lake. So 3 different areas of the country, 3 pretty drastically different lakes. I would say probably a nice, diverse, choice of different populations to look at. So this next part of the study, what he's talking about is all the evidence from the 3 different lakes. I'm kind of going to skip over a lot of this. I'm linking the video and the study in the description. So if you want to actually go through and watch all this, you can watch this whole presentation through yourself and form your own opinions. That's going to be in the description. So I'm not going to talk about what he found in each individual lake. One thing I will explain is he'll talk about significant or non-significant. Now in the science world, when you're analyzing your data, you get your results, you run these different tests, these different statistics to analyze them. For you to confidently say and have evidence that backs something, it has to be significant. Basically, significance just means that they're different enough that the mean of variation is not large enough to say that that's the reason that they're different. They are definitely different, and you have the stats to prove that. Whereas if they're insignificant, that means they might be different, but they're still too close within range so that there's, the variation could explain that difference. You can't confidently say they're different if it's non-significant. So I just want to explain that real quick, because people that aren't in the science world might be confused by what he's talking about there. So now looking at the results of the study, as you see on the slide here, they found no evidence that spring fishing negatively impact production of bass year classes.
So my take-home message from that is, despite some of the predictions that Dave and his folks would make, is there is absolutely no impact, no negative impact of opening the spring season on bass year class production in the lakes that we have data from in New York. It just appeared to make no difference. In most cases, the means were higher. Only in a few cases were they significantly higher. In one case, in that case, it was actually bigger year classes after the spring fishing opened. None of which, with my modest intellect, would I interpret as saying that spring fishing was hurting bass recruitment.
Now, in the data, they only actually found one of the comparisons that was significantly, remember I just talked about that, higher production of year class after the regulation change as opposed to before. But they did see 5 of 7 other that had higher production, but those comparisons just were not significant.
Now, when Dave was there, I was arguing that spring fishing actually promoted bigger year class production because that irritated them. And Dave and our friends, don't get me wrong. But there's a little bit back and forth that goes on. But we know that's probably not true. There's no mechanism by which fishing for bass in spring would produce bigger classes. I think what's going on, bass are responding positively to climate change. All kinds of studies show bigger year classes come from warmer summers. We have more warmer summers now than we used to have. So that's probably what's going on. Zebra mussels create conditions that are better for bass. So we have environmental conditions that are way offsetting any potential negative impacts to the angler. We're not saying there are negative impacts, but whatever else is going on that is good for bass is way more important in terms of what's going on recently than the spring fishing is.
So as you just saw there, definitely not the results you may have expected. A little bit surprising for me, it was for sure. Basically, spring fishing had no impact on the population of bass. In fact, it actually, in years that spring fishing was allowed, the population increased. So very interesting. So the first thing I want to point out is there was kind of a flaw with this study. It talks about spring fishing and kind of insinuates that the bed fishing is going on during this time frame that the study was conducted. The major flaw with this is, in my opinion, peak spawning is actually right around that June 15th period, depending on the weather of the year and the lake. But for these 3 lakes, I'm gonna have to say June 15th is usually right around the peak spawn. So what I'm getting at is spawning fishing was already happening before spring fishing was allowed. Now, although this is a major flaw for the argument of looking at the closed versus open season regulation change, it really doesn't change the result that much. At the end of the day, the population numbers are still increasing, and if anything, this further leads to saying that we have actually a lot less of an impact on these bass populations than we give ourselves credit for. I think that's the overarching theme of this and kind of my thoughts on it too. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. Really interesting in my opinion, really interesting study. I wish there was more like it out there. Definitely a different result than I would have expected from it. If you enjoyed this video, let me know. Leave me a comment what your opinions are, but again, try to leave it civil, and let me know if you want to see more of this kind of analysis. There are some other studies out there that I could definitely go through and break down. If this interested you, let me know, and we'll see you on the next one.